the creation of the American Republic. How did we get here? How did we become a country? How did the Constitution come into existence? If you remember from your basic American history, we were more or less 13 relatively peaceful colonies here. And after a while, the king and the parliament decided, you know what, we have all those colonists 3,000 miles away. Maybe we can make some money off them. So Parliament began enacting legislation, which was tepid at first and eventually became more aggressive, which was intended to extract wealth from the colonies. And these were basically taxes that the colonists had to pay. The taxes were collected by counting the number of windows on colonists' homes and taxing them per window. The colonists also paid taxes because the king's agents were at the ports, and so when items were imported into the 13 colonies, they didn't go directly into warehouses. They were counted and they were taxed, and the importer paid taxes, and then, of course, the tax was passed on to the consumer. Eventually, the taxes became serious and oppressive, and eventually Parliament did things like requiring that all goods that were shipped out of the United States, no matter where they were intended, pass through London. Well, why would Parliament want American goods to pass through London in an era when it took 3 months for the goods to get from New York to London so that they could be taxed there? So we're at about 1760 now. We have these two very burdensome financial obligations imposed upon everyone in the colonies by the Parliament. Everything coming in gets taxed, everything going out gets taxed. And it is in 1763 that Parliament enacts the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act required that every piece of paper in the possession of all the colonists in their private homes, every book, every pamphlet, every legal document, every financial document, even a poster or a pamphlet that was going to be nailed to a tree, had to have the king's stamp on it. How did the government in Great Britain, 3,000 miles away, know if you had purchased the stamps? That is, if the stamps were on all the papers in your possession in your home. Answer, Parliament enacted the Townshend Act. The Townshend Acts, plural, was an abominable series of pieces of legislation, the most offensive of which was the writs of assistance provision. A writ of assistance is a fancy phrase for a search warrant. And under the Townshend Acts, British soldiers were permitted to write their own search warrants in order to enter homes ostensibly to look for the stamps. So it was not uncommon to hear a knock on the door and to be handed a piece of paper by a British soldier in which he had authorized himself and his troops to enter, ostensibly to look for the stamps. And they did look for the stamps, but they might help themselves to other things in the house while they were there. Whatever they saw, whatever you couldn't prove that you had paid taxes to the king, they would seize. In some cases, they wouldn't leave, meaning they actually seized the house. There were rumors and whispers of this at the time, but we now know this to be so, that the Stamp Act cost the government more to enforce than it actually collected. So you would think to yourself, well, the purpose of a tax is to generate revenue for the government. Why would the government have a tax that cost more to collect than was actually collected? Well, maybe the government's purpose in the Stamp Act was not to collect revenue. Maybe the government's purpose in the Stamp Act was to subjugate the colonists, to remind them that even though the king and the parliament was 3,000 miles away, he could still, figuratively speaking, knock at your door and give himself permission to enter your house. The king couldn't do this in Great Britain, because in Great Britain, the king was subject to the Magna Carta. Now, we know the Magna Carta was forced on King John in 1215, and we know he wasn't too happy about signing it, but he did sign it. And every one of his successors took an oath to uphold it. The Magna Carta does not permit the king or his agents to cross the threshold without permission from a judge or without certain knowledge of crimes on the other side of the threshold. Yet the king and his agents, his soldiers, presumed to do the same thing here in the United States of America. Stamp Act was so unpopular that it was eventually rescinded by Parliament, but of course it was too late. It really was the last straw, if you will, in terms of the revolution. So at the end of the revolution, there really is no central government in the United States, certainly not as we understand it today, but there are 13 colonies, independent from each other, jealous of each other. And the colonies are pretty much run by the popularly elected legislatures. And who do you think got into the legislatures? The same merchants and bankers who had loaned money to the 13 colonies to finance the war. And what kind of legislation was enacted? Well, they enacted cartels to make it difficult for people to compete with them, and they enacted tariffs. This was a very difficult situation. You couldn't enter a profession or you couldn't enter a business unless the cartel that ran the business and ran the profession let you in, because the legislatures had allowed these cartels to exist. You couldn't ship your goods to another state without paying the tariff, and the tariff was so high that no one would want to purchase your product in the other state. So we are now in 1787. We have 13 separate colonies. We have 13 separate economies. Nobody even knows who the President of the United States was in 1787. The President had a term of 1 year. And the President really had no executive authority as we understand it today. There was no standing army. There were 13 militias, each of whom had been regulated by the governor of the state. And that's the way the revolution was fought. Those 13 militias, of course, were under the headship of General George Washington, but they basically were autonomous. The colonists were of the view that this was the safest way to protect themselves from any effort to take back their freedom. It is out of this that the American Republic is created. So in 1787, when the United States of America lawfully exists as the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation, there assembles in Philadelphia those who would, of course, write the Constitution. How did they get there? Well, they were sent there by conventions that took place in each of the 13 colonies. They sent, in rough proportion to their population, representatives to Philadelphia, who they all thought would amend the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation permitted this type of a convention as a mechanism for their amendment. Of course, we know what happened when they got there. They didn't amend the Articles of Confederation. They disregarded them, and they created the American Republic.